I was on the ramp and he was supposed to hop the railing and come after me with a chair, and he hopped the railing. I was like, wow, oh, he's coming after me.
When Big Show snapped for real, the wrestling world finally had to face a question it had been dodging for years. Was this man actually safe? Was the giant a character, or was he something far more dangerous? Paul Wight stood over 7 feet tall. He weighed close to 500 pounds during his peak years in the ring. He was the kind of man who made entire arenas go quiet just by walking through the curtain. He was the kind of performer who made you believe, really believe, that the rules of wrestling did not apply to him. Fans called him the world's largest athlete. Promoters called him a once-in-a-generation attraction. Broadcasters placed him on their screens because nothing quite filled a frame the way he did. For 2.5 decades, he stood at the center of the industry and held it there with his bare hands. And for a long time, everyone agreed that there had never been anything quite like him. He was not just big, he was an event. He was a walking argument that the natural world had produced something it was not entirely prepared to deal with. Every arena he entered felt slightly smaller once he was inside it. Every opponent standing across from him seemed to understand, at some instinctive and unverbalized level, that the normal rules of engagement did not apply here, that the usual professional protections a trained wrestler could expect from their environment might not hold in the same way they did with every other person on the roster. The business he worked in was built on the idea of controlled danger, scripted violence, choreographed destruction, and for most of the people who operated inside it, the gap between the scripted version of events and the real version was wide enough to be comfortable. For Paul Wight, that gap was much, much smaller. If this giant era still gets you going, tap the hype feature right now and give this video some hype. It helps more than you think, and this story is only getting started. But here's the thing about Paul Wight that nobody in WWE ever wanted to admit out loud. A 500-pound man does not come with an off switch. When something goes wrong, when pain hits, when pride is challenged, when a real punch lands where a work punch was supposed to be, the fallout is not a storyline problem. It is a real one, and it is a big one. This is the story of 5 moments when WWE could not control the giant, not the character, the actual man. And every single time, the company was left scrambling to clean up a mess that no script in any writer's room had ever planned for. 5 moments. 5 failures of control. 5 times the giant slipped the leash. And every time it happened, the people around him were left holding the consequences in both hands, working out how to manage a situation that none of their planning had anticipated. There is a reason the wrestling business marketed Paul Wight the way it did. They sold him as the Jolly Giant, the friendly 500-pound man who would smile and play along and make children laugh with his size. The man who was enormous but approachable, enormous but ultimately safe. The marketing demanded this because the alternative, openly acknowledging that a man of his physical dimensions, walking around in the same world as everyone else, was a constant and genuine liability, was not something you could put on a promotional poster or sell to a mainstream advertiser. So they put the smile on him. They built the character, they kept the camera on the grin, and moved it away from anything that suggested the underneath. And most of the time, it worked. The character held. The smile stayed in place, but not always. Not on 5 very significant occasions across a career that stretched across 2 of the biggest wrestling organizations in history and more than 2.5 decades of professional performance. 5 occasions when the smile was not enough. When what lay underneath the character pushed its way through into the real world and became something that required real consequences to resolve. Consider for a moment what it actually meant to be in the same industry as Paul Wight. You are a professional wrestler. You have trained for years, you understand the craft, you know the agreements and the unwritten rules and the way the business protects everyone inside it as long as everyone follows the protocols. And then Paul Wight walks through the door. And the protocols change because the person on the other side of the ring that night is not operating within the same set of physical parameters as everyone else. He is not bigger than you in the way that some wrestlers are bigger than others. He is bigger in a way that changes what is possible and what is dangerous and what the business can actually protect you from. The gap between Paul Wight and the people around him was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind. And that gap was the source of everything that followed. The 5 moments. The 5 times the business found out that its tools for managing people were not quite tools for managing him. What makes those 5 moments genuinely fascinating is not just what happened in each of them. It is the pattern they reveal when you look at them together. Each one arrived from a different different direction. Some were caused by production decisions, some by the physical reality of existing in a standard-sized world at a non-standard size, some by professional pride in the specific codes and hierarchies of the wrestling dressing room. But every single one produced the same underlying result: a corporation scrambling to manage a consequence it had not planned for and that no amount of creative strategy could fully address. And in every single one, the thing at the center of the problem was the same: Paul Wight, his body, his reflexes, his pride, his pain. 500 pounds of human reality that exceeded the capacity of every institution built to contain it. Let us start with a confession. In 2015, Paul Wight appeared on the Talk is Jericho podcast. He sat down, he relaxed, and he said something that changed the way wrestling fans thought about one of the most iconic moments in SmackDown history. He admitted that the legendary 2003 ring collapse, the one that millions of fans had believed for 12 years was a real, unplanned accident, was a rigged stunt from start to finish. Not a freak occurrence caused by two enormous men hitting the canvas at the same time. A planned stunt coordinated by a professional named Ellis Edwards, who served as a WWE's stunt coordinator, executed with technical precision, and then hidden behind a story for over a decade. Hidden deliberately, with the participation of everyone involved from the whole world. Think about what that means for a moment. For 12 full years, WWE and Paul Wight looked the world in the eye and said that ring was not supposed to break. They said the combined weight of nearly 800 pounds had simply been too much for the structure. And they said Brock Lesnar and Big Show had accidentally created one of the most shocking visual moments in wrestling history. And for 12 years, the world believed every word of it. 12 years of fans pointing to that clip as definitive proof. 12 years of the moment being cited as evidence that Paul Wight was simply too much for the physical world around him to contain without consequence. 12 years of a lie maintained with the discipline of a long-running institutional secret. It was a lie, a very well-planned, very carefully maintained lie. And the fact that they had to build that lie and protect it for over a decade tells you something deeply important about what Paul Wight's career was actually built on. The company needed the audience to believe he was too big to contain, too heavy for the ring to hold, too powerful for the physical world around him to survive intact. If people knew the truth, that the ring was rigged with airbags, that stunt coordinator Ellis Edwards had planned the whole sequence, that the collapse happened on a prearranged signal during a camera close-up while the production crew moved beneath the canvas, then the illusion would crack. And once that illusion cracked, the most valuable thing about Paul Wight as a performer would be gone. The illusion was the product. The illusion was what sold tickets and pay-per-views, and the idea that no night featuring Paul Wight was ever completely safe. The illusion was worth protecting, even if protecting it required 12 years of institutional silence, maintained across everyone who had been present for the segment, who had worked on the rigging, who had been part of planning the stunt, all of them keeping the secret because the secret was worth more than the truth. That is not a small institutional achievement. That is a corporate commitment to a deception on a scale that most organizations would never attempt. So what actually happened on 12th of June 2003 on that episode of SmackDown? Brock Lesnar climbed to the top rope with Paul Wight and performed a superplex. The ring imploded beneath them. The entire structure gave way, collapsing inward in a single dramatic moment that played out in full view of a live crowd and millions of viewers at home. The audience reacted with a silence that preceded a roar. Commentary sold the moment as genuine catastrophe. Television screens across the world showed two men disappearing into wreckage, dust rising, to the structure folding in on itself in a way that looked completely, utterly impossible to have planned in advance. The moment was replayed on highlight reels for years after it happened. It was cited constantly as proof that Paul Wight was genuinely too heavy for the sport, too massive for the equipment, too real to be fully held by any structure wrestling could build around him. It became absolutely central to his mythology, a genuinely organic disaster in the way it was framed and described. A moment when nature had intervened and made professional wrestling feel raw in a way that almost nothing else in the industry's history ever quite managed. But behind the cameras, during that close-up shot of the two men in the ring, production crew were moving fast underneath the canvas. Their airbags had been installed beneath the ring structure itself. While viewers at home watched the close-up, those airbags lifted the ring by a couple of inches, just enough to compromise the metal supports holding the entire frame together. The timing of the superplex was was synchronized with the moment the airbag pressure was released. When Lesnar executed the move, the ring had already been structurally weakened on purpose. The collapse was the result of precise engineering and exact timing, coordinated by Ellis Edwards, and executed by a production crew who all went home afterward and said nothing about it for 12 years. Nothing. Paul Wight described standing on the top corner of that rigged ring as being like standing on marbles. The surface was already moving and shifting beneath his 500-pound frame before the superplex had been thrown. He had to trust a stunt coordinator and a full production team with his physical safety while balanced in that position, knowing the whole structure beneath him was about to go. For a man of his size, that kind of trust in someone else's engineering is not a small act. That is a genuine commitment to a moment, made by a man who understood that the moment was worth the personal risk of standing on something deliberately coming apart beneath him. And yet, here is where the lie becomes its own category of failure. WWE did control the ring collapse. They controlled it completely, but they controlled it by manufacturing something that was not real and presenting it as real for over a decade. That is its own kind of losing control. Because once you build your biggest visual around a deception, you are gambling permanently. You are gambling that the people who know stay quiet. You are gambling that the star never has a candid moment on a podcast 12 years later. You are gambling that institutional silence is possible indefinitely across hundreds of people, none of whom ever tell the wrong person at the wrong moment. The lie lasted 12 years. When it came out in 2015, some fans were disappointed. Others were impressed by the engineering. But the real damage was to the myth at the center of Paul Wight's career. The myth that he was simply beyond full containment. If the ring collapse was a controlled and planned stunt, if Ellis Edwards had designed every element and the production crew had executed it on cue, then the question became unavoidable. What exactly was real about the giant being uncontrollable? And the honest answer to that question was waiting in the other four moments. Darker than any collapsing ring, far less cinematic, and entirely uncomplicatedly real. The success of the stunt also created a forward problem for WWE. Once the world had seen a ring implode under two giants, the pressure to repeat and escalate that spectacle became relentless. Later ring-breaking moments involving Mark Henry in 2011 and Braun Strowman in 2017 both achieved their intended effects, but neither landed with anything close to the force of the original. The original had the power of something the audience believed had never been planned by anyone. Once the template became familiar, the shock that made the 2003 moment so extraordinary became impossible to recapture. Before the ring collapse, before the balcony, before Floyd Mayweather, there was a hotel bar in Uniondale, New York, and there was a man named Robert Sawyer who genuinely believed he could test the limits of a 7-foot giant in public, in front of fans, and walk away with a story to tell his mates. June 1998, Paul Wight is working for WCW. He is at the Marriott Hotel in Uniondale after an event. He is in a bar with other people around him. This is an ordinary situation by any standard. A wrestler, after a show, in a hotel. Nothing unusual has been scheduled for this evening. No camera, no referee, no script and no finish. Just a man trying to exist in a space that was not designed to keep a man his size invisible to the kind of people who wanted to provoke him. Robert Sawyer is 30 years old. He stands 6 feet 6. He weighs around 220 pounds. By any measurement in any ordinary setting, he is a physically significant person. In almost any other room on earth, he would be among the biggest people there. But he has walked into a room where Wight has 7 inches and close to 200 pounds on him. In virtually any physical exchange between these two people, Sawyer is outmatched in every dimension before anything has been said or done. The numbers make the outcome of any physical confrontation almost mathematically certain before it begins. Around 100 fans are in the bar when Sawyer begins heckling Wight. He challenges his legitimacy as a performer. He makes suggestions about where Wight should really be working. He is loud about it. He wants the room to hear. He performs obscene gestures. Witnesses describe the degeneration ex-crotch chop, a gesture synonymous with the era's most rebellious performers. And he does all of this in full view of everyone present in that bar. He is performing for the audience of fans around him. He wants them to see him standing up to the giant and not backing down. He wants a reaction. He gets one. And then Robert Sawyer shoves Paul Wight in the chest. One punch. Sawyer's jaw broke. Compound jaw fracture. From a single strike that the court later found was a reaction rather than an initiation. Not a calculated decision. A reflex. Wight told the court he had been startled. That the physical contact from Sawyer was sudden and unexpected. That he reacted before he had any time to make a conscious decision. And the deeply uncomfortable truth here is that he was almost certainly telling the court something accurate. In the reflex of a man his size, the automatic physical response to unexpected contact carries consequences entirely unlike those of the same reflex in any other person. A standard-sized person startles and swings and either makes contact or misses. Paul Wight startles and swings, and the nearest person to him requires a trip to hospital with a fractured jaw. That is not aggression. That is physics. That is what happens when a man of that size is startled and his body responds before his mind catches up with what has happened. That is the physiological paradox of the giant in the real world. His power is so immense that a defensive reaction, not an attack, not an aggressive act, just a startled response to physical contact, produces catastrophic harm to a person who is significantly smaller and lighter. No wrestling promotion can script that. No production team can position themselves to intervene in time. No contract clause addresses what happens in a hotel bar at night when the script does not exist, and no finish has been planned by anybody. WCW could control his ring work to the second. They could protect his opponents with referees and layers of professional discipline and the unwritten agreements of the craft. They could not control what happened in the moments between shows when the giant was just a person in a world that was not built for someone his size and that offered him none of the protections the ring did. The legal case moved through Nassau criminal court slowly. Third-degree assault charges, months of professional uncertainty, a genuine threat to White's ability to continue performing in front of live audiences, and to the reputation of WCW, which had to publicly reckon with the fact that one of its most prominent performers had been charged with a criminal offense. The outcome in March 1999 was not guilty. Witnesses and young fans who had been present in that bar confirmed what they had seen. Sawyer had initiated physical contact. White had reacted. Self-defense was the finding. But 1 month before that verdict arrived, White signed a 10-year contract with the WWF. That timing was not coincidental. It reflected a decision made by an organization that had observed the Sawyer case and drawn a clear conclusion about what Paul Wight was and what he required. And he was a man whose physical dimensions made ordinary civilian life a permanent and genuinely uncontrollable liability. Managing that liability going forward was going to require an institutional awareness that went beyond creative planning and booking decisions. The Sawyer incident had established something clearly. Paul Wight required careful management, not just as a performer inside a ring, but as a person moving through ordinary spaces where no script existed and nobody was standing by to call the finish. If the Sawyer incident showed what happened when the giant was unscripted in the real world, then the 2004 balcony segment showed what happened when the script pushed so far past any reasonable boundary that millions of people stopped treating what they were watching as entertainment and reached for their phones to call for help. The storyline context had positioned Wight as a man who had come completely apart. He had lost to Eddie Guerrero after vowing to leave the sport if he did. The narrative that followed portrayed a giant operating without professional restraint, a man with nothing left to lose and no remaining reason to observe any rules about what he was or was not willing to do. The creative goal was to make viewers feel genuine fear, not the comfortable, enjoyable fear of a well-executed wrestling villain moment, the kind of fear that makes the brain start performing its own reality checks without being asked to. On SmackDown, Wight found Kurt Angle on a balcony roughly 15 feet above the arena floor. He grabbed Angle by the throat, he lifted him, and he chokeslammed Kurt Angle over the edge of that balcony. What viewers saw was a man falling 15 feet, a pool of blood forming beneath his head on the floor below, a leg bent in a direction that no living leg should bend, grotesquely out of position, suggesting injury of a kind that does not allow a person to simply stand up and walk away. And then, immediately after the impact, without any commentary or transition of any kind, the all rights reserved copyright graphic, the screen that appears at the very end of a broadcast to signal that the show is finished. It appeared right after the fall, before anyone spoke, before any camera moved, as if the production team had been forced to cut the show abruptly because something had just gone catastrophically wrong on live television and there was nothing else to do but go dark. The sound effect of the impact was timed precisely. The Angle left the frame, the blood spread, the leg was wrongly positioned, and then the copyright graphic appeared, and then nothing. Police stations received calls from viewers who believed they had just watched a murder on broadcast television. Not one or two concerned people ringing in. Multiple local stations reported being inundated. People who wanted to know if the man who had fallen from the balcony was alive. They were frightened in a way that was entirely genuine because what they had just watched had been engineered specifically to push them past the point where they could hold on to the idea that this was fiction. The reality of the segment was that Eric Angle, Kurt's brother, working as a stunt performer and double for the occasion, had taken the actual 15-foot fall. February 2008. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is at the No Way Out pay-per-view. Undefeated professional boxing champion. One of the finest technical fighters and most precise strikers the sport of boxing had ever produced. Around around 150 pounds, about to be involved in a segment with a man who outweighs him by more than 350 pounds. The creative concept required the audience to believe Mayweather's punches could genuinely hurt the giant. Without that belief, the David and Goliath framing had no emotional foundation at all. A 500-pound man and a 150-pound boxer occupy such different physical categories that the match only makes narrative sense if the audience believes the smaller man can cause real damage to the larger one. Paul Wight's solution to this creative problem was as direct as it was genuinely reckless, and he made it knowing exactly what the risk was. He told Floyd Mayweather to punch him for real. His reasoning was straightforward. If Mayweather connected and Whyte bled and reacted visibly, the feud would carry the weight of authentic injury. The audience would invest in it because they would have seen something real to justify their investment. So Whyte told Mayweather to go ahead, to bring the full commitment of a professional prize fighter to the moment without holding anything back. He also gave Mayweather a second instruction alongside the first. He told him to run immediately after landing the punches. He said this because he knew himself and what his body would do. He knew that if he was actually hurt, his response would not be scripted or professionally contained. He told the boxer, plainly and directly, that he might lose his temper when the pain arrived, and that what came after that warning would not be part of any plan that anyone had made. Mayweather delivered a swift combination that broke Whyte's nose and sent blood flowing into his mouth and throat. The adrenaline response that followed in a 500-pound body was not part of any plan anyone had written down beforehand. Whyte went over the security wall and into the crowd, chasing Mayweather through the paying audience. Arena security had not been briefed for this because nobody had written it into the night's running order. A giant with blood pouring from his face was moving through a crowd of thousands, and the only thing standing between that situation and something genuinely serious was Shane McMahon arriving backstage at exactly the right moment with exactly the right argument to make. Shane reminded Whyte of the financial stakes attached to what was happening. Around $20 million reported for Mayweather's involvement in the feud. Over 1 million pay-per-view buys. More than 74,000 people at WrestleMania, 24 in Orlando. Around 51 million in local economic activity for the city. And of everything, every pound of that investment, and every relationship that had been built to make the feud possible, resting on this continuing in a professional and manageable way. Whyte heard the argument and pulled back from whatever edge he had been standing on. But consider what had actually happened. The most financially significant match at WWE's most important annual event had been built around a man who had warned his co-performer that being hurt might make him uncontrollable, and had then proven that warning accurate the moment he was hurt. The company had no meaningful contingency for that outcome beyond one person arriving backstage at the right moment to make a financial argument. Shane McMahon talking someone down in a state of adrenaline-driven fury is not a contingency plan. It is a prayer that happened to work once. On a night when the stakes were high enough that they could not afford it not to. Also worth noting clearly, the reason this was a singles match at all was that Batista and Rey Mysterio had both suffered injuries that prevented the original tag format from going ahead as planned. WWE was forced to pivot to a singles encounter between Whyte and Mayweather by circumstance rather than design. Arecibo, Puerto Rico, 2009, the most private of the 5 moments, and in many ways the most revealing of all. No cameras, no audience, no storyline providing context or distance, just a dressing room after a show, 2 giants, and a room full of experienced and capable professionals who collectively made the decision to stand completely still and wait for whatever was happening to reach its own ending. Paul Wight had a signature overhand chop. He had developed it as part of his in-ring identity over years of work. He had made it known clearly across the roster that this was his move and that he did not want others using it. He had specifically asked the great Khali not to use it. During a tag match in Arecibo, Khali performed the chop directly in front of Whyte, while Whyte was standing on the apron just a few feet away, watching it happen in real time with nowhere to look except directly at what was being done. The words Whyte muttered on the apron were not ambiguous. The move had been taken without any discussion or permission. It was a deliberate act in front of the person it had been taken from. The confrontation in the dressing room that followed began with words. Whyte used an industry term for a poor worker. He called Khali the shits, a specific piece of wrestling vocabulary that carries a clear and universally understood meaning inside that world. It means someone not considered good at their craft. Khali, a man of comparable physical scale and with no apparent intention of backing down, he replied with the same insult delivered at his own pace and in his own accent. "You're the shits too, bro." 2 enormous men standing close together in a confined space, telling each other that neither of them was worth watching. Whyte threw Khali's luggage across the room. In the unwritten language of professional wrestling dressing rooms, that act carries a meaning that everyone present opponent understood instantly. Words were finished. The next thing that happened would not be verbal. The fight was described by those who witnessed it as something like King Kong meeting Godzilla in a room that was far too small for either of them. Wight threw the first punch, connecting solidly with the jaw. The sound of the impact was described in multiple accounts as something between a firearm going off and a large cut of meat being slammed onto a hard counter. Strikes were exchanged to the face, neck, and chest. The violence was real, and it was significant, and it was happening between two men whose combined mass made the physics of the situation almost incomprehensible from the perspective of anyone watching from a standard-sized body. The Undertaker and others moved between the two. The fight was over. Vince McMahon convened a closed-door meeting within days of what had happened. Wight had thrown the first punch that had converted a professional dispute over a signature move into an organizational and legal liability that the company was now responsible for managing. The 5 moments together form a pattern that is impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. The ring collapse and its 12-year manufactured deception. The balcony segment that sent viewers calling police stations. The Mayweather chase through tens of thousands of paying customers. The Arecibo brawl that froze a full dressing room of experienced professionals. Each one has a different cause and a different context. Each one has the same outcome. A structure that was supposed to contain Paul Wight failed, and the company was left managing consequences that had never appeared on any planning document. The ring collapse needed more than a decade of sustained institutional silence to survive as a myth. And the Sawyer incident needed a criminal defense case and months of genuine uncertainty before Wight's career could continue without question marks around it. The balcony segment triggered a public safety response from emergency services who had no way of knowing it was television. The Mayweather chase required one precisely timed conversation backstage to prevent a celebrity confrontation from reaching its physical conclusion in front of a massive crowd. The Arecibo brawl required a mandatory apology from the very top of the company and left an internal wound in the locker room that did not simply dissolve because a meeting had been held and words had been exchanged. None of those are storyline outcomes. Every one of them is a real institutional failure requiring real management from real people making real decisions under real pressure. When he told Mayweather to break his nose because the feud needed something real to stand on, he understood that his value was tied to the belief that he was not fully manageable, and he protected that belief with everything he had, even when the cost was pain and legal jeopardy and a forced apology in front of colleagues in a closed room in Arecibo. The dedication required to sustain a 12-year lie about a ring spot while continuing to work at the highest level of the industry, while managing chronic physical pain, while navigating the politics of a massive corporation, is not something that gets fully acknowledged in most conversations about Paul Wight. It deserves to be acknowledged. He was not simply a man who lost control on 5 occasions. He was a man who maintained an enormous amount of control over a very long time, under conditions that would have broken most people, while occasionally being human in ways that the corporate machinery around him was not equipped to handle. There is one final thing worth saying about all 5 of these moments and what they mean when you hold them together. In every single one of them, the people around Paul Wight reacted with something close to genuine shock. Not the performed shock of television, the actual shock of people confronting a situation that their experience had not prepared them for. The locker room in Arecibo froze. Shane McMahon had to run backstage to intercept a chase through a crowd. Police stations fielded calls from people who thought they had watched a murder. A court in Nassau had to process the reality of a jaw broken by a single defensive punch. These reactions were not disproportionate. They were proportionate to the actual thing. Paul Wight was a phenomenon that exceeded the capacity of the institutions around him to manage on the fly. That is not a criticism. That is simply the truth. And the truth is worth saying clearly without flinching from it, because it is the only version of the story that does full justice to what Paul Wight actually was. But Uniondale and Arecibo were not performances. They were not decisions made in service of a story or in support of a creative goal. They were a man of impossible physical scale living in moments where no one had written a finish and nobody was there to call it. And in those moments, the giant responded to the world around him with the full weight of everything he was. Here is what must be said before this story closes. Because the honest account of Paul Wight cannot only be the moments when things went wrong. That would be a convenient story, but not a complete one. He gave everything he had to this business across more than 25 years. He stood on a ring that felt like marbles beneath him and trusted production to keep him safe because the moment mattered and he believed in delivering moments that mattered. He allowed a professional boxer to break his nose because the feud required something the audience could see and believe in. He maintained institutional secrets for over a decade because he believed the audience deserved to feel something genuine, even when the reality behind that feeling was manufactured by a stunt coordinator refrigerator and a set of airbags. He lived with daily pain that would have ended most careers and kept returning to arenas and kept delivering what the business and the fans expected of him. The wrestling world was a different and more compelling place because Paul Wight existed in it. Every fan who watched him felt something that is genuinely rare in any form of entertainment. The sensation that the rules might not hold tonight, that the Giant might really lose it this time, that nobody in the building was entirely prepared for what might happen next. That feeling was his gift to the audience, and he delivered it night after night, year after year, for a very long time. The 5 moments in this story are the times that feeling was not a performance, when it was completely, uncomplicatedly real. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about Paul Wight's legacy. Every wrestling company in history has had big men on its roster. Men who stood out by height and by weight, men who were given special treatment because of what they looked like and what they could do. But none of them presented the specific and recurring problem that Paul Wight presented, because none of them combined his exact dimensions with his exact professional longevity with the specific industry context of an era in which the line between performance and reality was constantly being tested and blurred. He arrived at a moment when wrestling was trying to feel more real. He was the most real thing in it, and that combination produced consequences that no boardroom, no creative team, and no corporate risk assessment was fully equipped to anticipate. The control was always the real opponent. Sometimes the opponent won, but the Giant kept going year after year, and that is its kind of remarkable.